Hello and good evening or morning or afternoon, depending on where you're listening to this podcast. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Where's Ian? Well, Ian is not here because this is a very special edition of the Cloud Native Attitude where we'll be talking about building scalable and systems that work at scale, which was a topic that came up 2 episodes ago. And I have to say, I'm joined by the man who started this discussion almost 10 years ago. Welcome to the Cloud Native Attitude, Allard. Hello.
Hi, James. Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's good to be here.
Allard, before we talk about systems and how they should be scaled and how they shouldn't be scaled, tell me about Axonic, which is not only a super cool product that you invented, but became a super cool company that you built around this awesome piece of software. When did you start this? 10 years ago? 12 years ago?
17, actually. I have to go back 17 years to get to the start of this. Well, just series of just things that happened one after the other that led to, let's say, just some moments that every now and then I look back and think, really? But it started.
Years.
Sorry?
17 years. What happened to our lives?
Well, a lot. A lot has happened in those 17 years. But if we don't take it too broad. 17 years ago, I was just really frustrated by some of the complexity that I found in systems I was working on, right? 17 years ago was the era of perfectly fine monolithic systems. Nothing was wrong, right? Everything was just one big deployable WAR file or EAR file if you were in the enterprise Java space. I still get bumps in my neck saying those words. And I got really frustrated with the complexity, because I felt that the complexity of the solution should not outgrow the complexity of the problem that you're trying to solve. And that was not the case in most projects. So I started to explore different ways. And that's when I started building the Axon framework, which is basically a framework for implementing CQRS and event sourcing in the Java, on the JVM, in the Java ecosystem. And well, that was a really fun project. It just started as a learning experience. I just wanted to learn something, and that's perfectly fine. My boss gave me some time, but he said there's two requirements. First of all, whatever code you produce is open source. And second, you will give a presentation about your findings in a couple of weeks.
Very cool. You have a cool boss. I guess you're still owing one.
Sorry?
Yeah, I guess you still owe him a few beers, that guy.
Probably. When we get to a certain point, I'll certainly. Well, I have met him a couple of times since then. He moved on as well, and yeah, it's good fun. But so I did that. I published it online, and the disadvantage of or advantage of publishing online is you need a name. So initially it was another name, but we came up with Axon later on, and I started to talk about it, and then I was asked to talk about it at a conference and another conference, and then do some training somewhere. And at some point, people started to use it in production. It wasn't me. I wasn't the first one to use Axon in production. It was somebody else. And that we noticed that downloads were growing, and we thought, hey, what kind of things are people building with these applications, with this framework? And we found out there were very mission critical systems at large enterprises. And we thought, well, let's see if we can make a buck out of it. And that's what we're doing now. And we are currently 40 people running Axonic, which is the company behind Axon.
Exactly. So this feels like some sort of dream come true. You and I both know people who have produced software, whether it's open source or otherwise, successfully. And we know people who have built businesses successfully. But very rarely do you come across somebody who built a piece of software and then built their own business around it. So obviously, many congratulations. How does that feel right now? Now you're in your 10th year of running Axonic?
Yeah, so Axonic is 8 years old. Yeah, so this is the 9th year. But sometimes it's kind of surreal, right? It's every now and then you just wake up and think, really? Is it really? I just built a little library of things that solve my problem, right? Is this really something that I should hire 40 people for to do all sorts of stuff? But then fortunately, you just look at the people and what they're doing, and you look at your list of customers. That's actually a pretty nice thing to do every time you have this imposter syndrome trying to catch up with you. Just look at the facts. Just look at the list of clients, and you go like, okay, I'm not an imposter, right? They can't be wrong.
No,
That's
exactly.
the
Yeah, the proof
feeling.
is in your customers for sure. Okay, so it would have been about 8, 9, maybe even 10 years ago when I saw you give a talk in Amsterdam. And it was just at the point when we were starting Container Solutions. And you said something that resonated really deeply with me. And you gave me the words for what I was trying to do at the time. And I think you said, although you could probably quote yourself better than I can,
For
but I think
sure.
you said something along the lines of, I don't build systems that work at scale. I build systems that can be scaled. And I was
Yes.
like, yes, this is it. And so I wanted to invite you here today to discuss that single concept and maybe share with us how did that idea begin for you and how did that develop over time in your mind?
Yeah. So, because obviously I knew I was going to show up here to discuss that. So that's exactly the question I had in my mind, that I felt like, why am I here anyway? Why did I say that? And if we go back to that time where basically Axon was created out of that frustration, actually we have to go a little bit further back, further into the future, because microservices started around 2014. I think is when Sam Newman published his book, and it became really popular.
So you might not remember, but that evening you spoke with Sam. It was you were on the same bill at that community event.
Yeah, I do remember there was a community event, and he was talking about some crazy idea of small components, and I was probably talking about another crazy idea. I
Yeah, that's
remember
and
that.
it's the very same, it was the exact same event, and I don't know why I remember it so clearly, but it was a really definitive evening for me.
Yeah, and you know what's funny? It took me a couple of years to realize how connected Axon Framework is to microservices. So even though we both presented something that same night at a go-to night, I think it was, at that moment, I did not realize that whatever I was working on was so connected to microservices. That realization came actually 2 or 3 years later, still before we founded Axonic. But in that time, before Axonic, that I was working on Axon, well, Axon was a side project for me. My main day-to-day job was essentially came down to troubleshooting projects. So there were either projects that we had started ourselves, but mostly projects that our future customers had started, and they wanted us to figure out what was going on. And I've done quite a few of those analyses. What struck me is that more than half of the projects that I've investigated were microservices projects, and they were building something at massive scales and had zero business success,
Right.
either
Well, I
as a
had that
result
visual.
or as a side effect.
Yeah.
And then I realized, hey, but what are these guys doing wrong? What's the problem here? And a lot of times systems are built to replace something else, but they are never a one-on-one replacement, right? There's always some business requirement that requires you to make some changes, and therefore the new system will be different than the old one. Kind of makes sense, right? You're not going to build exactly the same thing, but if you're building something else, it also means that you're not sure how successful it will be. So to just assume that, oh, we're going to build this and we will be massively successful and we will start this at scale, you're doing a lot of upfront investment that you never know you will realize.
Right.
Plus the complexity, right? I mean, just look at the little shopping list of your standard microservices deployment. That's a long list, right? And that's all you need to just get started.
Do you think there is something cognitively different to people? Why is it so difficult for people to understand this? So for example, I've got in front of me a book. Now, if people are listening to this on the podcast, then they're not going to be able to see it, but I'm going to hold it up. And the title is Thomas Edison, Success and Innovation Through Failure. And it's written by a guy from the University of Sydney called Ian Wills. And it's a difficult book to read. It's an academic book. But he basically says at one point, the lessons that you learn during system development are lost to history. So people pop along and they think, oh, the grid just came out of nowhere. Thomas Edison somehow invented the grid as we know it today. Well, that's not true. Through a series of trial and error, he invented the incandescent light bulb and the wires and the motors and the generators and the meters, and all the stuff that didn't work vanished to history like footprints on a beach, and what was left was with the system. But I thought everybody in technology knew that, and yet it's now 2025, and I'm still working with customers, or frankly, it drives me round the bed sometimes, who are thinking about what the end picture looks like and not the process of trial and error that gets them from a system that can scale to a system that works at scale. And I think my question to you is, why? Why is that mental blockage? Where does that come from?
To be honest, I really don't know. I don't know where it comes from. That's my journey. I'm trying to find out. I have a feeling that if I understand this, I don't. I'm lost for names right now. Who is
The problem
really?
is, to Allard, I'll tell you what, there's a serious problem with my podcast. A lot of my guests are middle-aged men like me.
Yes.
So then the memory starts to fail them. And then the other thing is, it's only a matter of time before we start talking about Java.
Yeah, exactly.
So don't worry, you're not the first guest to not quite recall a name. Who are you thinking of? A technology?
E is MC square. Come on, it's not that difficult.
Einstein.
Einstein, there we go. How can I not come up with that name? I think it's Einstein who said that if you truly understand the problem, you're already 90% on the way to the solution, right?
Right.
And I think this is one of those problems where if we understand where it comes from, it'll be easy to solve. But it is difficult because humans are strange creatures. I guess that's why I love working with computers. They're very predictable. And every time you find a mistake, well, almost every time, it's a human mistake.
Well, so my hypothesis is that, you probably remember Maslow and his hierarchy of psychological needs. When we're children, if your safety needs are not quite met, you have an absent parent or you live in a tough neighborhood, as you get older, because you've not quite advanced to the next level, you seek a safe environment. Now, I don't know how many of my customers are going to text me, start sending me WhatsApp, screaming at me now, but my hypotheses are that large organizations attract towards them people who, want to play it safe and don't necessarily want to take risks. And learning as you go is a series of risk-taking and learning through failures. And I think the type of person who enjoys learning through failures is not necessarily the type of person drawn to a large organization. So this is the kind of hypothesis I'm working on. I can't quite articulate it properly yet, but I think it might be something to do with risk-seeking.
There's a big cultural thing as well. If we compare Europe to the US, for example, in the US, when you talk to founders, they will very proudly tell you, I failed 4 startups and look at me now, right? They will be proud of their 4 failures because they did a genuine attempt on something.
Yeah.
In Europe, we have a little bit more of the tendency to say, oh, I failed as a founder. Let me do something else because I'm not good at this. We see failure as the finite state, which is the bad state, and we want to avoid that. So we tend to avoid failure a bit more. And that might be true in larger organizations, and maybe that's if in a graph success is at the top right, then all you want to do is, usually time moves anyway, regardless of what you do. So you just want to go up a little bit all the time. But the path to success is not a straight line, right? We all know that you need failures and you need good failures to get better at something, right?
I genuinely think the problem is there might be some people in larger organizations who don't mind failing, but if they do get failed, they get severely punished for it. And I think the challenge for Container Solutions is we have now written a lot about failure, learning through failure. People are buying the books and they read them and they ask us to come and help. But they really struggle to fail openly because they're afraid. And it's not they're in their imagination. They have political enemies in the organization who will love to point out, you brought in Allard and Axonic and it didn't work. You failed.
Exactly.
Or you brought in Container Solutions. So I don't think our customers are in any way lacking courage. They work in environments where their political opponents, or even sometimes their people they're friendly with, will keep score of the times they failed. Right. And you cannot build large-scale systems with that attitude.
No, not at all. No, you have to be able to fail. You have to do it in the loudest way possible, taking as many people with you in the journey, not in the journey down, but in the journey of, hey, look, this is my failure. How can we learn from this all together?
Yeah.
And in our organization, we unfortunately a former colleague, but she had a really nice way of putting this, and she always called it my best failure. And that's the way she would always refer to, what's your best failure? Which means a failure is good, but a better failure is the best failure, right?
Well,
that's
the truth is a crisis is the ultimate failure and therefore the ultimate learning experience. So if I look at COVID and the challenges we faced at Container Solutions, it was a nightmare. This is not me feeling like a failure thinking, oh, well, that life happens. This is me crying and thinking, I've got all these people relying on the decisions I make, people with mortgages and kids. The stress was absolutely crippling, but it was a great learning experience. So, and then when you get through it, of course, you grow in confidence. If you get through it and succeed, you grow in confidence. If you get through it and continue to fail, you become wiser and you're a bit more battered. But I always say to people, I'm comfortable with failure from test-driven development all the way to being an entrepreneur, but I don't like it. I don't like failing. I don't like feeling ashamed and embarrassed and cringing. Sometimes, I don't know what you're like in your position, Allard, but sometimes I say things to rally the troops, and then 6 months later, I'm like, can't believe I said that. But I had to do it because I had to say something. I had to try to find the words. And Yeah, failure sucks, basically.
It makes you human, right? In the end, some people think that, oh, Allard invented Axon, he must be some superhuman. No, I don't know. I always say, right now we're working on Axon 5, and people ask, oh, what's going to be different? And they're like, well, this time's going to be good because I failed 4 times. And they laugh. Practically, that is what it is. Every time you've built something and it wasn't the best thing. It's impossible to build the best thing from the start. And it's by calling small things failures that are not apparent failures, you just make the word failure look fine.
So failure is normal, so failure must be normalized. That's what I say all the time to my people. Now, Allard, before we start to wrap up, I want to try to get to the essence of this, right? So just let's go over this one more time. So you have a system that's complete, Netflix, Amazon, it's working at scale. How do you get from having nothing to that system in a sensible, safe way? How do you build systems that can later scale? That's the question for you.
So the magic word here is the same as it has been for several decades, modularity.
Right.
Modularity, well, we all know low coupling, high cohesion, and all of that, blah, blah, blah. But we just have to accept that it is really, really difficult to achieve a state of high cohesion and low coupling. That is difficult, period. And we're not going to get it right the first go.
Right.
Assuming we get it right the first time and that we know exactly what 2 years from now the business really needs, can we just call that stupidity, insanity, or something really negative so that we don't even think of doing that? What we need to accept is we do not know in software, right? And so we need to build an environment, literally as in a software environment, but also as in a people environment where we can adapt to change as easily as possible. And unfortunately, a very large-scale microservices deployment with 50 microservices and 1 customer does not make you very flexible. A big monolithic system that has internal modules and some packages that are dependent is a lot easier to change than when we deploy everything separately. Then that is just building the part at scale versus not building at scale, right? But that doesn't automatically make it a scalable system. And there's still the concept of, in my post in LinkedIn, I used a dung beetle on a big ball of dung. I call that the big ball of mud. And I make some jokes about the beetle being the architect of the big ball of mud and being proud of what it's created. But it doesn't understand that that thing is not composable in any way. It's just one, and either it falls apart or it's. So we need to find that modularity. And then the thing I recommend people to have a serious look at is, how do these components within your system, how do they communicate? And I really recommend explicit messages, so objects that represent the messages that flow from one place to another.
Right.
Because as soon as you decide that, hey, we do need to extract something and start deploying as separate services, you don't want to break the entire flow of communication. You just want to change the way the message is now passed across the wire to the other service. And in the past, we've seen several cases where people said to me that they were very happy with this approach because in their original plans, they had plans for hundreds of microservices, right? They designed everything separate. They decided to start with a monolith, and they said, we ended up with 12 microservices and we're in a good state now. That was enough. Right.
So if I paraphrase back what I think I'm hearing from you, so on the one hand, modularization is absolutely key. But I'm guessing there's an assumption in there that you've got people in your team who know how to draw the boundaries between modules.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, you don't have those.
But those people are very rare, right?
I don't think they exist. As in, there's people that in hindsight can do it. Those are the good ones. You definitely need some of those on board. The problem is it's always in hindsight, right? But to predict the future is impossible. So you can have a gut feel, but you have to be able to change the structure of your system.
Right. Okay, so then what you're saying is you need people who are comfortable understanding we're not going to get this right first time, so let's evolve in the next year or two to the architect that we need. So that does say something about the flexibility of the type of people who can succeed with scalable systems, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, fine. So you need a certain type of mindset. Okay, what about the organization around them? If they're not allowed to fail, is it possible to produce scalable systems in an organization that doesn't tolerate failure?
In an organization that tolerates failure, you typically just have one failure.
Yeah,
and that's the end of everything.
Yeah. Now, okay.
If you tolerate failure, then you'll have lots of them, and they will hopefully be small. But if you tell a group of people that, hey, build me this system, and it has to accommodate, let's say we sell tickets to a concert, and you have to be able to sell tickets to a concert that has 100,000 visitors. And by the way, they're going to sell out in 10 seconds. What kind of system are you going to build? You've got one chance to build it. Well, you're going to over-engineer. You're going to massively complicate things. But if you just say, hey, it's a ticketing sales system, let's start small. Okay, can we do 200 people? Can we have a venue of 1,000 now? Can we just 10x every time, and then see where things start to cringe and then improve? So fail, right?
So Allard, this is a perfect time to end it. So we've had on this podcast so far Sam Newman. He said microservice is your architecture of last resort, meaning it's not. It shouldn't be your first choice every time. Adrian Moore, quoting Brian Cantrell, said, containers did to, let me see if I can get this quote right. He said, let me get this right, Docker will do to apt what apt did to tar. And now from you, we've had an absolutely awesome quote. If you work in a company that doesn't tolerate failure, you only have one failure.
Yes.
Yeah, and it will be a big one.
It will be big, yes, and it will be bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Allard, so much for joining me. I know for sure that our listeners will really look forward to listening to this particular bonus podcast. When I share this on LinkedIn, share all the links to your website, share the releases of the next version of Axon, and I'm sure people will click on those links and download and have a play around. Thank you for coming, Allard.
Thanks for having me.
That's been
Allard.
I've been Jamie. Until next time, see you then.